Imagine going to sleep in a city with a working airport beside the downtown skyline. Planes are parked there. Pilots expect to use it again. The control tower is standing. The runway is intact. Nothing appears unusual. Then, sometime after midnight, heavy construction equipment enters the airport. There is no public announcement. No long countdown. No farewell ceremony. And according to contemporary aviation reporting, even the Federal Aviation Administration had not been warned. The machines move onto the runway. Then they begin destroying it. Huge sections of asphalt are ripped apart. One enormous X appears. Then another. Then another. By sunrise, there are massive X-shaped cuts carved directly into the runway. The message is impossible to misunderstand. Nobody is landing here again. But this was not vandalism. It was not an accident. It was not a terrorist attack. The people destroying the airport had been sent there by the city of Chicago, and the order came from the mayor. This is the strange final night of Meigs Field. And the more you look at what happened, the stranger the story becomes. Because the airport had not suddenly become abandoned. Aircraft were still sitting there when the runway was destroyed. To understand why anyone would do this, we have to go back to the beginning. Meigs Field opened in 1948 on Northerly Island, a narrow piece of land sitting beside Lake Michigan. Its location was extraordinary. Instead of landing far outside Chicago and then traveling toward downtown, pilots, using Meigs, could arrive almost directly beside the heart of the city. Look one way, and there was the water. Look the other way, and the Chicago skyline seemed almost close enough to touch. For decades, Meigs served private pilots, business travelers, and other aviation traffic. But the airport became famous for another reason, too. Millions of people who had never visited Meigs Field still knew exactly what it looked like, because it became closely associated with Microsoft Flight Simulator. For years, when players opened versions of the game and started flying, Meigs Field was the familiar starting point. A tiny real airport beside Chicago became one of the most recognizable virtual airports in gaming. But back in the real Chicago, the future of Meigs was becoming increasingly uncertain. Mayor Richard Daley wanted something different for Northerly Island. He wanted the airport removed and the land returned to public recreational use. This was not a new idea that appeared suddenly in 2003. The future of Meigs had already been fought over for years. The airport's lease expired during the 1990s. There were political battles, attempts to close it, efforts to save it. At one point, Meigs temporarily stopped operating before reopening. Then, in late 2001, something happened that appeared to give supporters of the airport security about its future. The city and the state announced an agreement connected to major aviation plans for the Chicago area. Under that agreement, Meigs was expected to remain open for years. To pilots and airport supporters, the fight looked as though it had finally reached some kind of settlement. Meigs was still there. Aircraft continued arriving. And then came the night of March 30th into March 31st, 2003. Chicago was asleep. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, city construction crews moved onto Meigs Field. Heavy equipment reached the runway. Then the digging started. Large X-shaped sections were carved into the asphalt. The airport's only runway was being made unusable. This was not the beginning of a scheduled reconstruction project. The city was closing Meigs immediately. And according to contemporary reports, the people who should have known that an airport was about to disappear did not know. The Federal Aviation Administration had not received advance warning. The airport's control tower had not been told in advance. Pilots had not been given the normal opportunity to plan around the closure. And most dramatically of all, there were aircraft still parked at Meigs when the runway was destroyed. Around 16 aircraft was stranded. Think about that for a moment. You park your aircraft at a functioning airport. You expect a runway to be waiting when you return. And when morning comes, the runway has enormous holes cut across it. You cannot simply take off because the city deliberately destroyed the surface you were supposed to use. The stranded pilots eventually received permission to leave using the parallel taxiway. One by one, the remaining aircraft departed. But they were never coming back. Meigs Field was finished. And now everyone wanted the answer to one question. Why? Richard Daley gave a serious explanation. Security. This happened less than 2 years after the September 11th attacks, during a period when American cities were intensely concerned about possible terrorist attacks. Daley argued that Meigs created an unacceptable risk because an aircraft using the airport could potentially approach downtown Chicago. From his perspective, leaving the airport open meant accepting a danger that he was no longer willing to accept. But almost immediately, people began questioning that explanation. Because Daley had wanted Meigs gone long before September 11th. His desire to turn Northerly Island into parkland was already well known. And just days before the destruction, aviation authorities had implemented flight restrictions around downtown Chicago while still allowing normal operations around Meigs. There had also been statements from aviation and security authorities indicating there was no credible aerial threat against downtown Chicago at that moment. So critics looked at the timing and saw something very different. They believed the security argument had given the mayor the justification to finally accomplish something he had wanted for years. Daley rejected the outrage. His basic argument was simple. He believed he had acted to protect Chicago. But there was another reason the overnight destruction caused such anger. Normally, closing an airport is not supposed to happen by surprise. The Federal Aviation Administration later alleged that Chicago had failed to provide the required 30 days of advance notice before deactivating Meigs Field. The agency sought a civil penalty of $33,000 over that issue. The city eventually reached a settlement in the federal case. But by then, none of that could bring the airport back. The runway had already been destroyed. The aircraft had already left. And once the physical airport disappeared, the entire argument changed. There was no longer a debate about whether Meigs should close someday. It was closed. That may have been the most important part of the overnight operation. Once those machines cut through the runway, reversing the decision became enormously more difficult. You could protest. You could investigate. You could argue about regulations. You could accuse the mayor of abusing his power. But you could no longer land an aircraft there. The decision had been transformed from a political argument into a physical reality. And that is why the story still feels unbelievable. This was not simply a city announcing that an airport would close next year. It was a city government effectively saying, by the time everyone wakes up and begins arguing about this, the runway will already be gone. The anger was enormous. Pilot organizations condemned Daley. Aviation groups challenged the closure. Critics accused the mayor of using the darkness to prevent opponents from stopping him. Daley remained unapologetic. He maintained that his responsibility was protecting Chicago. And in the end, whether people supported the airport or hated it, one fact became undeniable. Richard Daley won the fight. Meigs Field never reopened. The airport buildings gradually lost their aviation purpose. Northerly Island was transformed. Today, instead of aircraft rolling toward a runway beside the Chicago skyline, visitors find parkland, walking paths, prairie grasses, fishing areas, and public recreational space. The former terminal survives as part of Northerly Island. But the airport itself is gone. And there is something almost eerie about looking at photographs of the location today. Because if you did not know the history, you could walk through the area without fully understanding what once happened there. For more than half a century, aircraft arrived and departed from this narrow strip beside Lake Michigan. Pilots knew it. Business travelers used it. Gamers around the world virtually took off from it. Then, in the darkness of one night, machines crossed onto the runway and began cutting enormous X's into the ground. There is still a debate hidden inside this story. Was Richard Daley making a difficult security decision that he believed was necessary to protect Chicago? Or did he use security concerns to accomplish a political goal he had pursued long before those concerns existed? There is no mystery about who destroyed Meigs Field. We know exactly who ordered it. The mystery is why it had to be done like this, without the normal warning, in the middle of the night, with aircraft still sitting on the field. Perhaps Daley believed that if he announced the closure in advance, another political fight would begin. Perhaps he believed opponents would find another way to keep Meigs alive. What is documented is what happened next. Chicago went to sleep with an airport. Before much of the city woke up, its runway had been deliberately destroyed. Not by criminals. Not by an enemy. Not by protesters. By Chicago itself. And once the sun came up, everyone could argue about whether it should have happened. But nobody could undo what had already been carved into the runway.